Welcome to episode 1 of East 17th Street, a new podcast by the Daily Hoosier. I guess I'll start out with, telling you why we're doing this and what it's going to be about. First of all, the name East 17th Street. I think most people in this space recognize that pretty much anything that happens related to IU athletics happens on East 17th Street. Memorial Stadium's there, Simon Scott Assembly Hall's there, the offices of IU athletics are there. So, if it's happening in the IU athletics space, it's happening on East 17th Street, which I guess that could be a jingle that we use down the road here with this podcast. But my vision for this thing is just to be diverse and variable with it. We'll do short topical podcasts like we're going to do today as we talk about IU football's fall camp. I think we'll do longer form stuff with guests. It's just going to be a little bit of everything. It's not going to be on a set schedule every week. It's just as things happen and as we have things to say, we'll post a new episode to share it with you. I'm Mike Schumann. I am the publisher of the Daily Hoosier. Been at it for 7 years and feel like it was finally time to add our voices to this space. I think it was a little bit reluctant to do it early on because there's a lot of podcasts in the IU space, and I just wanted to make sure that I established credibility, got relationships, and really felt confident adding my voice to the mix. This is the 7th season that we will be credentialed as an outlet for men's basketball. It's going to be the 6th season for IU football. So I think we're at that point now where we've really kind of established our voice and our relationships in and around IU athletics and have something to offer for everybody here. Joining on this episode is Seth, who's going to, believe it or not, for me anyway, entering his 3rd season with both IU football and basketball. It seems like he just started with us, but year number 3 coming up for Seth. And then Owen Graham entering his 2nd season, student in Indiana. Seth, by the way, also a graduate of IU and a professional in the journalism space for a while. So, but both of them have a lot of familiarity with IU. And what I like about this group right here is that we kind of have a diverse set of perspectives. Owen has the current student perspective, Seth's the young professional, and I'm the old timer. So I think between the 3 of us, we have a lot to offer and share with you guys. As I mentioned, I think for episode 1 here, we've been in and around IU football practice going back to the spring. Seth and Owen have been doing most of the work. I've been the lazy one back at home. Did get to a couple practices at fall camp last week. But Seth and Owen, I think between the 2 of them, have been to just about every practice that's been open to the media back to the spring. And then here through fall camp, we had our last open to the media session yesterday. So I thought it was a really good time to connect with these 2 guys and with the fan base to just kind of share what we've seen in what is a new era of IU football, and an exciting era. I think a lot of people, I'm sensing more enthusiasm for IU football than I have, at least since going into the 2021 season. So I wanted to touch base with both of these guys, and I think I'll start with you, Seth, in just talking about that new era. Kurt Cignetti, brand new coach, a lot of energy, no doubt about that. Not afraid to speak his mind either. But give us your impressions of what you're seeing from him, like actually on the practice field. Like what stands out to you as you watch Kurt Cignetti on the practice field at fall camp?
Yeah, it's funny for all the big game that he talks, and he really has done a great job of hyping up the fans. Like I wrote about it after Big Ten Media Days, that it almost feels intentional, like the way he's gone about all of that, just kind of building up the energy and the excitement among the fan base. I think he's done a great job of that. But for all the big game he talks, I mean, he's kind of settled into this, what feels like kind of that CEO head coach type role. He's not really like getting involved that often with, individual players on the practice field. He's not like inserting himself into a lot of the hands-on coaching aspects of practice. He's kind of just milling about, like he's got notes in front of him all the time. He's, observing everything and taking everything in, but it seems like he's really comfortable with his staff that he's hired to kind of do more of that hands-on coaching out on the practice field. And he's just letting his people do their thing. Like he obviously, I'm sure we only see, to be clear, we only got to see, when the practices are open to the media, we get to see like the first 30, 40 minutes of that. We don't really see 11 on 11 or anything like that. So, obviously there's only so much that you can really glean from that. But he, from what we see, I mean, he's just kind of it seems like out on the practice field, he's just kind of letting his people do their thing, which it's just an interesting kind of dichotomy from the big game that he talks hyping everybody up, when he kind of makes himself feel like that central character when you see him out on the practice field, and he's very much not the central character.
Yeah, and oh, and it's also an interesting dichotomy from last year and the last few years with Tom Allen with the omnipresent megaphone that he blared throughout fall camp. I have to confess, maybe it's my old ears, but I could rarely understand what he was saying through that megaphone. But as Seth, I like Seth's description of kind of like a CEO type presence, where Tom Allen was just all energy all the time, and it's not to take a shot at Allen. He had success with that, at least for a couple of years. But, what do you notice? What else do you notice that's different this year versus last year with just the way practice is structured? At least as Seth said, the part that we're able to see.
Yeah, I think it was Omar Cooper who commented to it, especially towards us after a practice. He said it's very, I think he believed he said it was very fast paced compared to Tom Allen's practice. It's a lot, I guess, more intentional with every kind of drill that they're doing and every kind of rep that they're taking in every sort of practice. And like Seth mentioned, it's a lot of individual work with excuse me, with positional groups and their coordinators in that setting. And Curt Cignetti has kind of taken that backseat role where he kind of just trusts his coordinators to get the players right in those specific drills. And then once they come together, which is kind of spread out through the kind of practice that we were able to see, then you kind of see Curt Cignetti maybe take a little bit of a step in, but still kind of leaving the work to his coordinators and trusting them with that. But outside of what Seth already mentioned, I mean, yeah, it's a lot more fast paced. Players are always running around. I know a few times me and Seth had to step out of the way when the O linemen come behind us, and we could get ran over. So
you always want to get out of their way.
Yes, absolutely. I don't want to get crushed by any of those big guys, but it's a lot more fast paced, and it's very intentional with the work they're doing, and it's definitely a big difference.
Yeah, Seth, I've never heard a football coach or really any college athletics coach say that they don't necessarily intend to use all the practices or practice time that's available to them to the NCAA. And I think that kind of goes to Owen's point that they're very crisp and efficient. I mean, do you notice that as well with what they're doing? What kind of stands out to you from that standpoint?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's kind of an under the radar sort of quirk, like something that you might not. And honestly, like I'm not sure that I realized it until I heard a couple other people mention it at one point. But you when you go to enough football practices, you usually and you could definitely tell this at Tom Allen practices in the past that there was the big clock that would be running, and they'd be running through all their periods that way. And
Right.
For all the megaphone that Tom Allen would be yelling through, you would definitely from time to time hear like a big, horn sound, and then it would just a loud over the speaker, period 3 or period
Right.
4,
Right.
and that would kind of usher them from one thing to the next. And Cignetti doesn't use a clock in his practices. So I think he, as part of his milling about, like I mentioned, I guess he's just seeing the reps and making sure that everybody's doing what they're supposed to do and being productive, and that he likes what he's seeing. And he said, like, when I feel like, we've done enough in that period, then he blows the whistle and they move on to the next thing. And I think that's got to be part of it. Like, when you have a clock off to the side, certainly it may be human nature to just kind of look at the clock, you see it running down, and then you start thinking about what's next. And, maybe that leads to a couple guys dogging reps here and there and just kind of waiting, trying to get through that. And if you don't have a clock staring you down, you just kind of naturally are going to be all in on each rep more. You don't know when that whistle is coming. And so certainly that could have the inverse effect where maybe you blow the whistle too early and you don't feel like you've done enough. But maybe if it's leading to more intentional reps, then maybe there's some give and take there. I just that's kind of an interesting quirk, and who knows what sort of impact that'll really have on the team or on the season. But when you're talking about differences in practice, I think that was kind of interesting.
And I think there's something to it there with like keeping everybody on their toes. Like I think even his assistants don't necessarily know what's coming. I was watching last week, Pat Kuntz go through a drill with the defensive tackles, and he spent like 2 or 3 minutes kind of explaining exactly how he wanted the drill to go. And then the whistle blew, and he's like, "Okay, I guess we're done here." And they never actually did the drill that he intended to do. So I think everybody's on their toes a little bit with Cignetti. Have either of you guys like seen him like blow up, on a player, or, show much emotion at all throughout the spring or fall?
I can kind of take this one. I think there was one specific moment where I believe it was the offense doing reps, and they had some other offensive players on the defensive side. So the defense was still on their own kind of segment of the field. And I think there was some problem with the offensive line. And of course, I mean, Bob Bostad was a voice to hear in that. But also Cignetti kind of came in and was like, he blew up a little bit and was like, "Hey, focus up." I'm not too sure exactly what he said, but to me, I think that's only happened once when I was there. I don't know if, Seth, you've had a different experience, but there's only been really that one kind of situation where it was really kind of a position, like in the entire position group, the entire offensive line that made a mistake, and he had to let them know about it. But outside of that, like, I agree with Seth, it's definitely been kind of taking a step back and watching the coordinators do most of the work.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen Cignetti step in a couple times. It's hard for me individually. I think it's hard for me to say that he really blew up at anybody. A couple little things happened. He'd come in and kind of say something, but it wasn't like he was really, really yelling at anybody from what I can remember. I mean, there may have been 1 or 2 times in the spring where we were kind of, after the point where we were able to watch practice if you left and then came back, or maybe it was when practice was closed one day and we were just showing up waiting to go down to do our press availability afterwards. And from, way far away, we could hear Cignetti yelling at the whole team at the end of practice. So, I mean, but that's really the only other thing that even comes close to that. It doesn't seem like, at least from what we've seen, that I can't remember him really blowing up at any of the guys on the field.
Yeah, I know he likes to say that, he's selective about, how much he actually even addresses the team. He doesn't want to lose his voice. He doesn't want to, not literally like Tom Allen did, but he wants his voice to resonate with the team. So when he says something, he picks his spots. So I think that might be part of it too. I want to move over to the quarterbacks. I think, Cignetti said he's not going to name a starter, but I think we all know at this point that, at least it would be a major surprise if Curtis Rourke is not the starter on day one. So I guess, Owen, give me your, reaction to what you've seen out of Rourke throughout the spring and fall. He's had plenty of reps throughout all those times. He's a guy that, played in the MAC. So, that one of the obvious questions is how well that will translate. But what have you seen out of him? What do you like about his game, and what questions do you still have?
Yeah, I mean, I think with Rourke, you can definitely tell there's some veteran presence there. Even he's not the most vocal person, but he when the quarterbacks are kind of working individually with Tino Sunseri, he's kind of a leader in that group in that sort of aspect. But outside of that, I mean, he looks just very polished as a quarterback. I mean, you could tell he's been playing quarterback in college for a few years, just taking in any kind of suggestions that Tino makes and implementing that in the next few reps that he takes. In terms of his actual play, I really like his short ball accuracy. I think him and Miles Price are definitely going to be a nice little tandem, especially with Price kind of acting as that maybe security blanket in certain cases. But yeah, I mean, Curtis Rourke, I think the biggest question for me is maybe if he can use his legs. I know he's had rushing touchdowns. He had plenty the past few seasons at Ohio, but we kind of saw in the spring game, he got pressured a lot and he did not handle that pressure the best. So I think with these Big Ten defenses that obviously get a lot tougher as he moves into the Big Ten, I think that's going to be the biggest question for him is can he get flushed out of the pocket? Can he still make a throw or extend the play with his legs and maybe gain a few yards in that aspect? But I think there's a lot to like about Curtis Rourke. I think the veteran kind of leadership that he brings is exactly what you want for Curt Cignetti and a first-year head coach in a Big Ten program. And I think fans are going to really like what they see from Rourke week one.
Yeah, I know that he had a really good 2022 season. You know, it was the MAC, I think, Offensive Player of the Year. And then he actually suffered an injury at the end of that season. And it, you know, I analogize what happened to him similar to Michael Penix, where it was a late season injury and he just wasn't himself at the beginning of 2023. And to your point, Owen, I think mobility is a big question with him because of that. You know, spring games and practices are a little bit unique because he knows he's not going to get hit. So I don't think his instincts are as dialed in as they would be in a live setting. But Seth, I guess to that point, you know, do you? And again, we got to caveat everything. We see what we see, but they have done some quote unquote scrimmage type work that in front of us. It's not live, but it's, you know, he's at least escaping the pocket situationally. What are you seeing from him from a mobility standpoint? And also if you have any reaction to just his overall, you know, arm strength and accuracy, I'd be interested in hearing about that.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I don't feel like there's been a ton of that we've seen from the quarterbacks as far as, the one's offense against the one's defense. Like, it doesn't feel like we've really seen. And obviously when we do see that, they haven't really been tackling much in practice, if at all. So there's just kind of that, and they definitely weren't in the spring game either with Rourke. Right. So that's kind of that extra element. Like, you know, I don't read a ton into the spring game as far as, you know, all that pressure. And honestly, I know you're right about the injury and that he did take a step back overall in 2023. But when you look at the rushing numbers, I mean, IU fans will probably look back on last season and think that one of Brendan Sorsby's stronger attributes was his running ability and his ability to kind of make plays with his legs. So even last year, Curtis Rourke was a more efficient rusher on a per carry basis than Sorsby was. So, I mean, he had 3.3 yards per attempt last year, 3.4 in 2022. Sorsby was at 2.4 yards per attempt last year. So even with those mobility questions, I'm not sure that I'm that concerned about it. Obviously, once you get into game mode here, you know, maybe there's going to be some red flags or things that we're a little bit concerned about as far as his ability to get out of the pocket if things are kind of collapsing on him. I am not really concerned about that yet. I think the rushing ability is probably a little underrated by everybody just because people see him as this like kind of pocket passer and this guy. I think maybe one of his biggest attributes, getting away from the legs a little bit, I think what IU is probably going to be happiest with is, I mean, forget like the explosiveness, you know, of the offense, forget like, you know, whatever accuracy. I think it's, if he's taking care of the ball, I think that's the biggest thing. And he's got that kind of, like Owen mentioned, kind of that veteran presence, that veteran poise. Like, he doesn't seem like the type that's really going to make a lot of mistakes and be super careless with the ball, which I think is really important because when you're looking at the biggest strengths of this team, the offensive playmakers really are one of the biggest strengths of the team. And you want a quarterback that's not going to be careless and reckless with possession and fumble the ball a lot and throw it to the defense. Like, you just want a guy that's going to be able to get it in the hands of the playmakers and let them go to work.
Yeah, and Cignetti talks about that a lot. Like, he likes to, you know, getting back to 2nd and 10 and things like that. Just not putting the team in a hole, not putting yourselves in a situation where you're, you know, going 3 and out which I think was a big problem with Indiana the last few years. I think most people recognize that. If I'm like worried or skeptical about Rourke, I go back to recent history and Connor Bazelak. It'd be interesting to kind of compare what people were saying about him 2 years ago versus what people are saying about Rourke now, because I think we all looked at Bazelak's resume, which, in some regards was even more impressive because he did it in the SEC. And for whatever reason, it just didn't click with him. I think a big part of it was the offensive line. He was just never comfortable in the pocket, and his legs weren't a real asset for him. So I guess, Owen, what gives you comfort that Rourke is going to be different than Bazelak? Is it the offensive line, the coaching staff, or what stands out to you that tells you this is going to be a little bit different?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to recognize the offensive line looks a whole lot different than it did 2 seasons ago. I mean, you have the introduction of Bob Bostad, and obviously you saw a little bit of improvement from that 2022 season to 2023. But I think with Rourke specifically, I think his ability to just, have that veteran presence and make the right play is going to be pretty key. I think, Bazelak, kind of when he got mid-season, he kind of struggled with some accuracy issues, kind of maybe forcing some balls downfield that didn't need to go that way. I think Rourke, in this kind of setting where he's getting Big Ten play, I think he's going to have in the back of his mind to kind of protect that ball and try to give Indiana the best chance they can to score on every possession that he comes in. So I think the veteran presence with that, and also just the weapons that he has around him this year are kind of like Seth mentioned, one of the best few definitely in the Big Ten, specifically with wide receivers. I mean, you have Donovan McCoy returning. You have Elijah Surratt, 1,000+ yards receiving at JMU. Miles Price, like I said, kind of that slot guy that can kind of be your security blanket on third down and long situations. And then the depth, I mean, Omar Cooper showed some really good flashes last season. We haven't really seen a lot from EJ Williams yet because he dealt with some injury issues last year. So I think the weapons around him give him the best possibility to really transition into the Big Ten well, and combine that with Kurt Cignetti and obviously Mike Shanahan, the offensive coordinator. I think it's going to be a really Curtis Rourke has the best possible kind of group to succeed as he transitions into the Big Ten.
Yeah, and I think I'd be remiss if I left the quarterback conversation without mentioning the depth chart, because I think it's really interesting. I can't tell you the last time Indiana has opened a season with 2 4-star recruits on their bench, as the depth pieces. I think, everybody knows Taven Jackson, was a 4-star from the Indianapolis suburb, started his career at Tennessee. Tyler Cherry went to the same high school as Taven Jackson. They were actually teammates for a couple of years at Center Grove. Another 4-star. I mean, these are guys that, everybody believes at some point will be starting, in Jackson's case again, in their college careers. What are you seeing from those guys? And do you have a level of comfort that if things go wrong, I mean, I think most people who follow IU football know that it's rare to get through a season without a second quarterback seeing the field, even a third and fourth at times. So what gives you comfort that these guys are going to be able to step up? And I assume, Jackson is going to be the backup if that does occur.
Yeah, I mean, Jackson is definitely the second string here. Cherry, I would presume, is the third string there. Honestly, I think Taven Jackson's actually looked really good in camp, like especially when you're comparing it to, we saw plenty of him last year. We were able to, in spring, we were able to watch, last spring, I guess ahead of last season, we were able to be at full practices and see a little bit more. And I mean, we saw plenty of struggles from Taven Jackson. He came in probably expected to be the starter, and then just he never got it done. And it really, it played out the way it played out with him and Brendan Sorsby. But there was a lot of inaccuracy, I thought, from Taven Jackson last year, and just he seemed like he just made a lot of mistakes, and the coaching staff really got on him about all of that. I mean, obviously we see a little bit less of practice this year than we did last year, like I mentioned, but I think Taven's actually looked pretty good. Like he's dropped a lot of dimes in down the field and, hooked up with a lot of these receivers. He looks pretty good. Like when you ask Kurt Cignetti, the couple of times Kurt Cignetti has talked about him, the biggest thing he mentions with Taven is kind of, he needs to just get there on a more consistent basis, kind of develop get there, kind of play in, play out. Like he's doing what he needs to be doing out there most of the time, but he just kind of, needs that kind of last step to really get there, which if that's what you're looking at in your backup quarterback, that's better than probably a lot of teams are going to be able to feel about their backup quarterback situation. Like Rourke is going to be the guy, but I think at least from what we've seen in camp, like if something should happen and they have to go to Taven, I think they could feel decently comfortable that Taven can step in and keep the ship afloat, at least compared to, what we saw out of Taven last year. I thought he's looked pretty good this fall camp. Tyler Cherry has the long-term potential, but even after having, being here this spring, like he's still just kind of getting his feet wet in college football. And, there's been progress, there's been growth, but it's going to take some time. Not every, top recruit comes in and lights it up immediately. Certainly, not in football. And he's not at that level yet where he can step on the field and play, but I think he's going to get there.
Yeah, and I think if all goes according to plan, he'll end up redshirting this year. And, you never know. I think that was the plan for Donovan McCulley his freshman year, and we all remember how that worked out. So you just never know in those situations. I want to go to running back. I promise I'm not going to go through every position group, but I did want to touch on the running backs anyway, because I think it's interesting. I've got this old school way of thinking about running backs where you got your main back and you got your third down back and you got your short yardage guy. But I don't think we have that situation here. I think, Kurt Cignetti commented the other day, like if the three main running backs walked into the room, they'd all kind of look like the same guy, at least physically, same stature. And I don't see, at least from my limited viewings, a lot of difference between the three guys. Do you think this is going to be like it sounds like it's going to be a committee. Do you think it's going to be like a series by series, like a guy's going to get a chance for one series, and if he builds momentum, he keeps going, and we're not going to really see that kind of situational running back this year with short yardage and third downs?
Yeah, I think it's going to be kind of a series by series kind of basis, because I come into practice one day and I think I'll see Kalen Black running with the quote unquote ones to start practice. You come back the next day and it's Ellison, and then you come back next week and Tyson Lawton's in there. So I think it's really going to be kind of maybe a case by case basis, like you said, maybe a series by series kind of switch up. But in terms of who I've liked seeing, I really like what I've seen out of Kalen Black. I think he has that potential to be your kind of power back, but also has a little bit of speed on the outside, and he can also kind of provide kind of both of those kind of situations. And Ellison and Tyson Lawton are really good backup pieces, but even Elijah Green coming out of North Carolina, he had a really productive junior season before he dealt with injuries the last season. So I think, like Kurt Cignetti said, he's going to probably stay around three backs, but if he needs to go deeper, he can definitely do that with Green and even Van Horst, who's had a little bit of time back there. But yeah, I think running back positions, kind of like wide receivers, they have a lot of options, and I wouldn't be surprised if they go deep if things happen and injuries plague that room. But I think they're pretty set with their three guys, Black, Ellison, and Lawton back there.
Yeah, I know we were sitting in the press box at Lucas Oil a year ago, and we watched Josh Henderson line up 7 yards behind the line of scrimmage when they needed like 6 inches. And we all sat there and wondered, why didn't they give the ball to Trent Howland? Seth, did they have a guy like that this year? I know Howland and pretty much everybody from last year is gone, but is there a back that you would say, okay, in that situation, that's who you're giving the ball to?
Well, that's a pretty unique situation that I'm sure Indiana would rather avoid. I mean, I don't know that they have anybody on this roster that's built the way Trent Howland is built.
Few people are.
To be there. Yeah, right. So, I mean, I think honestly, like it feels a little to me like lost at Lawton of the three. I think between Lawton or Black, it feels like those two could be a little bit more of the bruiser type than Ellison. But
Right.
We also again have not seen a ton of them as far as like true game reps or game like reps from what we're able to see. It's a lot of like drills and like coming out of the backfield, just on like passing routes and things like that. But so I'm not sure if there's anybody. I'm not sure if I know yet who. Okay, it's 4th and 1. Like this is the running back you want to give the ball to. Like I think there's probably a number of different candidates that you could feel good about, but there's nobody. I mean, even going into the year last year, I was starting to point out like this Trent Howland guy looks huge, looks like a guy that you want to give the ball to right up the middle. Like there's nobody that kind of strikes you in the face like that quite yet. But I mean, I guess let's see how it all plays out.
Yeah, too bad we didn't have a podcast a year ago because I can vouch for the fact that you were banging the Howland drum early and often.
Yeah, he stood out in practice. I mean, you walk by the running back group in practice at that point, and he was just bigger. And he was just bigger than like everybody else there, and didn't look like a running. He looked like a bit of a fish out of water with the running backs.
Right. I wanted to quickly just cover a few more topics. It sounded like yesterday, and you guys can confirm this. I don't know. It sounded like Nick Toomer might be moving back to cornerback. Is that what you got out of Cignetti's comments yesterday?
Yeah, I think the possibility is definitely there just because he obviously took most of his reps there last season, but also you kind of factor in JoJo Johnson's coming down with an injury. I know he mentioned Jameer Johnson also was dealing with a few things. So I think the possibility of moving Toomer back to corner is definitely on the table. But, it's key to remember that Toomer was recruited as a safety coming out of high school, and that's probably the position he personally feels most comfortable with. But if they need to use him in both of those situations, maybe he plays some snaps at safety, maybe he plays some snaps at corner. That's definitely also on the table. But it's definitely how the health of JoJo Johnson is going to come around, and if they need an extra guy or two in there. And I think Nick Toomer definitely could see some spots at corner.
What do we got going on in the background? Are we cutting grass, or what am I hearing there?
I think they're cutting grass outside my place. Sorry.
It has to be the first episode. You get all that out of the way.
You don't control the timing on that, Seth? Come on.
I'll go down and give them a piece of my mind shortly.
Your dog, I guess I should have introduced our guest there in the background. So well behaved, and yet the lawn guys are the ones that interrupt episode 1.
Yeah, Ollie's a good boy.
One more question. As you've watched fall camp, who would you say, or either player or position group? And I know, Owen, you've already written about some under the radar players. So why don't you give me your under the radar position group? Like, what group do you think is really going to stand out this year that maybe nobody's talking about?
I think I'm gonna go with linebacker, and it's kind of an interesting position group because they're not usually the ones going for sacks, but they're also not usually the ones grabbing interceptions, and they're usually doing the dirty work, making tackles. But I think a lot of people are really gonna like Aiden Fisher. Just he seems to be the captain on the defensive side, and I think that's going to remain true going into the season. But they also have a lot of depth there. Jalen Walker is really athletic for the linebacker position. And then Isaiah Jones, who I was in kind of my piece about my underrated players. I mean, we haven't really seen much of him, but it's really apparent that Cignetti and the staff kind of trust him, maybe rotating in some reps with the ones and coming in with the twos. So I think the linebacker position is experienced. I think they have some depth there as well. You throw in Joshua Rudolph, who's seen a few snaps in his career at IU. So I think that's kind of a group that's maybe flown a little bit under the radar because, like I said, a lot of people like to talk about sacks, forced fumbles, and interceptions. But the linebacker group, I think, is going to be really impressive this upcoming season.
Yeah, and I'll throw in my opinion here. I'm a little bit optimistic about the defensive front. You know, I like Mikhail Kamara. I like James Carpenter, both JMU transfers. I think they're both going to come in and have an impact from day one. I think Marcus Burris, as a returner, is going to have a nice impact as well. You know, CJ West, the transfer from the MAC. I think those four, give me confidence. I know defensive line is always that position that's kind of make or break for a defense because if you don't get any pressure, you're going to get eaten alive in the Big Ten. But I think, given the scheme that Bryant Haynes runs, they focus on getting pressure. They focus on getting in the backfield. They take chances. And, I don't know how well the secondary is going to hold up when they take those chances, but I do think we'll see more pressure in the backfield than what we've seen in recent years. So I am cautiously optimistic with that group. Seth, I'll ask it to you a little bit differently. What's your biggest area of concern with this team based on what you've seen so far?
Gosh, why do I feel like every time I record something is when they go do work outside, but right outside my place? Anyway, the area of concern, I think, is I think there's some depth concerns overall. Like we really saw that. Like I said, I try not to make too much of the spring game, but that was a big kind of glaring red flag that we saw during the spring game was that the two defense, like the second and third string defense, looked rough. Like Taven Jackson stood out in that spring game, but it was a lot of because the second team defense did not look very good. Right. And there were some real, I think there's some real depth concerns with the defense. Like you say, I think Kamara is exciting and up front, some of those guys, but I don't think the defensive line was super great last year. Like we had all that excitement about Andre Carter. And then he, after a couple big games early on, he was really like the biggest threat, and they weren't consistently getting enough from everybody else to where they could, other teams were able to really zero in on Andre Carter, take him out of the game, and there just wasn't enough consistent threat for elsewhere, depth wise, and certainly when inevitably guys are going to get hurt. I don't think that the line was that great last year. I think I like the upgrades they made. Kamara is good. I think Carpenter is good, but once if guys start to get hurt, what's going to happen? I don't know that the depth up there is outstanding. I think like we said, the linebacker tandem looks really good. What does, I know Owen has pointed out Isaiah Jones, but just what does the depth really, not that you want to game plan for every single player getting hurt or, having major injuries at every single position, but just what does this depth look like when, a couple guys pick up some lingering issues or a couple guys have to miss a couple weeks. I'm not sure that the depth really across, in the secondary too, there's, at cornerback, everybody, D'Angelo Pons has looked really good, and there's all the excitement there about a couple other DBs, but at cornerback, I'm not sure that there's a ton of really standout depth. There's a lot of names that people are going to recognize because at cornerback may have more returnees than any other position group on the team, but I'm not sure that the depth at that position, especially if Pons was, has to miss some time this season, I'm not sure that the defensive depth is really a strong suit of this team, and they may need to hope that they stay healthy for the most part. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm off base here, and maybe they've really worked on this stuff, more than we can see, I guess, in fall, as far as kind of building up that depth and adding some guys since spring and all of that. But I think the defensive depth is a concern. And I'll point out offensive line depth as well, especially after the Nick Kidwell injury, because I was just writing about this. And, with Kidwell out and now you're leaning on, Kurt Cignetti has said, between the two guard spots there, it's probably going to be these three guys chipping in to share those duties between Bray Lynch, Drew Evans, and Tyler Stevens. And if there's injuries there, there's already been an injury there with Kidwell, and it's just, as more guys start to go down, the depth, you just don't really have the depth. And now 2 of those 3 guys have barely played college football. And so you're not just saying you may be thin on bodies now, you're really thin on experience. And if some of these guys start to struggle, what's going to happen? So while I think there's a lot to like about what you see kind of at the forefront of the team, I think there's a little bit of concern under the hood.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It's one of those hidden things that it's hard to quantify, hard to focus on when you're talking about a team because you focus on the starters, but you do see it rear its head. You mentioned a great point about Andre Carter last year. I think, Indiana didn't have enough threats beyond him. As you said, teams just keyed on him, and Indiana couldn't respond to that in any meaningful way. And it also rears its head on special teams. I think, a recurring issue every year with Indiana is, other elite teams in the Big Ten have better special teams because their second and third stringers are guys that we'd probably be starting for most Indiana teams. And so there's just better athleticism across the boards with teams. So I think it's always something to consider. I think we'll wrap it up there for today. I think maybe next week we could get together and do some predictions for the upcoming season. I think, as I mentioned, there's a lot of excitement for this team. And I think, I've seen an over-under consistently right around 5.5, which puts it right on the margin for, being bowl eligible. I think people can see it going a number of different ways, anywhere from, the typical IU season a lot of people have grown accustomed to some real potential with what I would call a manageable schedule for next year. So be prepared for that next week. And I thank you guys for both joining today.
Thank you, Mike.